In my time here, what I want to do is to bring you a message of hope and change. The title of my talk in the program is something along the lines of the Bush-Obama bailout will permanently change the nature of American capitalism. That's the change part. And the hope part is, I hope it's not true. I want to talk about, actually a little bit broader than the bailout. I want to talk about economic policy that's occurred over the past year. And it's almost breathtaking. I mean, it's hard to talk about, and I think maybe in 5 years' time we'll look back and see things a little differently. But a year ago it would have been hard to imagine all the things that we've seen in the past year as far as changes in economic policy. And I am fearful that these changes will fundamentally change the nature of American capitalism in a manner similar to the way that we look back and think about the New Deal or, to a lesser extent, the Great Society. There are four particular aspects of policy I want to talk about. The role of the Federal Reserve, the TARP program, the stimulus package, and bailouts. Let me start with the Federal Reserve. For decades, I've taught my students about what the Federal Reserve Bank does. And essentially, the main thing that the Federal Reserve Bank does is control the size of the money supply through open market operations. Or at least that's what I've taught for decades. And they do that by buying and selling government securities. And that's changed. Over the last year, the Federal Reserve has started buying non-government securities. Something completely new and a major change in policy, and something I don't see the press picking up on. And the second thing the Federal Reserve does, to a lesser extent now, but this is really why the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, to make loans to member banks. Banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System can go to the discount window and borrow against their assets. And a major change has occurred over the last year. The Federal Reserve is making loans to other financial institutions, non-bank financial institutions. These are two huge changes in Federal Reserve policy that I don't think have been sufficiently noted. People have talked about the huge increase in the financial base over the last year. Yep, that's real. But the bigger policy change over the long run, I think, when you look at Federal Reserve policy, is they're buying non-government assets instead of federal bonds, federal government bonds like they used to, and they're extending loans to institutions that are not member banks of the Federal Reserve System. This has all the makings of setting the Federal Reserve Bank up as a designer of industrial policy in the United States, at least prior to what the last year's policies. The Federal Reserve was relatively neutral as far as its treatment of various industries and businesses in the economy. It could create a lot of inflation by expanding the money supply, but it did so in a neutral way by buying and selling government securities. When it's buying securities that are non-government securities, it's picking and choosing who it's going to support. And that has the makings, the very foundation of setting up an industrial policy and making the Federal Reserve an agent of industrial policy. It's very troubling. Very troubling. That's the change part. The hope part is I hope it's not true, but I'll talk a little bit more about that hope part at the end. I'm going to end on a hopeful note, I promise. It's troubling to see the change in the Federal Reserve Bank over the last year. And in my title, I deliberately, obviously titled this the Bush-Obama policies. Ben Bernanke is a Bush appointee, and these policies started in the Bush administration. So regrettably, the policies we're looking at today, the policies I'm talking about right now are bipartisan policies. We can't say it's because we now have a Democratic majority or a Democratic president. These things were started under President Bush. Second thing I want to talk about is the TARP program. Y'all remember when Secretary Paulson announced that the financial system was in such crisis that we immediately need $700 billion essentially to be spent at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, what he argued was the $700 billion would go toward buying these so-called toxic securities that we needed to get them off of the balance sheet of the banks and so forth in order to restart the financial system. Now, in hindsight, was this argument correct? We can see it wasn't, because that's not what the money was used for. Essentially, Paulson and Bush rushed this thing through Congress, pressured Congress to pass this $700 billion emergency package to buy those toxic assets. The legislation essentially left the disposition of that $700 billion to the Secretary of the Treasury. And they did look pretty hard at how they could buy up those toxic assets. I actually have a significant number of economist friends who were hired as consultants to the Treasury Department to try to come up with an auction scheme to buy those assets. But I think they decided it just wasn't feasible to do it. But, whatever, they didn't do it. Instead, what they've used the money for, about half of it up to this point, so there's still another $350 billion pending, but what they used the money for was to take equity interest in banks. This is not what the TARP originally was. That wasn't what they said they were going to use the money for, but instead they've used it to take equity interest in banks. And so now, as you know, the federal government owns a significant equity interest in a lot of large banks. One result of that is in the popular press. You've seen discussion about the nationalization of banks. And sure enough, when the federal government owns a big share of these banks, what else might we call it but the nationalization of banks? And of course that's troubling too, and it goes right along with Federal Reserve policy. If the federal government is the owner of the banks, then who's going to get the loans? Who's going to be financially supported by those financial intermediaries? Well, it's up to the federal government. So again, we're moving in the direction of industrial policy as the federal government takes over our financial system. I hope it's not true. And what they say, and what we can hope will happen is that the federal government, they plan to divest themselves of this equity interest when the financial system gets back on sound footing. But you can see where this might be headed. Where essentially the federal government sort of through the back door here, but controlling financial institutions ultimately decides which businesses are going to get loans, which industries are going to be supported, and so forth. Very troubling. Very troubling. The third issue I wanted to talk about was the stimulus package. I think so much has been said about this. Probably don't need to talk about it in too much detail. But even, when you look at the Keynesian justification for the stimulus package, right? More government spending, boosting aggregate demand and so forth. But you look at what the money's being spent for, and really if you go back and you look at President Obama's campaign rhetoric about where he wanted to spend money, where he thought the federal government should get more involved, that stimulus bill looks a lot like the fulfillment of President Obama's campaign promises. He was able to get those things passed through Congress under the guise of it being a stimulus package, but most of that money isn't even going to be spent in 2009. Current forecasts seem to suggest by 2010, a year from now, the economy will be recovering. We won't need the stimulus, but the money already is going to be appropriated. So, it's not really a stimulus package at all. It's the advancement of President Obama's agenda for greater federal government involvement throughout the economy. Now, I might step back and say the whole idea behind this stimulus package, the Keynesian idea behind this stimulus package, is that if you increase aggregate demand by increasing government spending, by cutting taxes, and 95% of you people are going to get a tax cut. But that's the whole part. But if you look at the logic of that, what that would suggest is if we increase spending and cut taxes, raising the deficit, that's going to increase aggregate demand and lead us to prosperity. When President Bush took office, we had a surplus in the federal budget. If, in fact, increasing government spending and cutting taxes, raising the deficit, if that would stimulate the economy and lead us to prosperity, we ought to be in nirvana now. I mean, after the huge and increasing deficits of the Bush administration. But nevertheless, that's the approach that we're taking to stimulus today. So, ultimately, what that stimulus package is going to do is going to build in another 5% or so of GDP into government spending, and we're going to have a permanently larger public sector, as a result. I hope it's not true. But it's hard to see how you're going to reverse that government spending once it gets into place. To the point where even some politicians see this. I think there's at the moment 4 state governors who say they're not taking the stimulus money from the federal government because it's coming with strings attached. And once that stimulus money runs out, the states are going to have to foot the bill, either that or kick a bunch of people off Medicaid and welfare programs and so forth. And those governors rightly see, once the state is supporting these people, it's going to be very difficult politically to move back on that. Again, it's very troubling. The fourth thing I want to talk about is the bailouts. We see the bailouts of these financial firms. I guess we've talked a little bit about that already under the guise of the TARP program and so forth. We're in the process of bailing out the automobile industry, Chrysler and General Motors. And again, this is very troubling. It's just elementary economics that the way the market system works is based on the incentives provided through profits and losses. Right. If a firm takes resources and combines those resources and produces output that's worth more than the resources it used to produce that output, that's a good thing for all of us, right? Because it's increasing the value of resources. So these firms that take resources and combine them into output that's more valuable than the resources they used, we should reward them for that because they're doing a great thing for our economy. And in fact, the market system does reward firms for that. That's what profit is. And if firms take resources and combine them into output, and the output is worth less than the resources that they use to produce the output, that harms the economy. And we should penalize firms that do this. And the market system does that. That's what losses are. It's the penalty that firms pay for taking more valuable resources and combining them into output that's worth less than the resources that they used to produce the output. When President Obama was campaigning last summer and gas prices were up over $4 a gallon, he said one of the things he was going to do was to put an excess profits tax on the oil industry. Now, if gas at $4 a gallon, you'd think that, people would want more gasoline and that we would be inclined to reward firms that would provide it to us. But President Obama's idea is, no, we should penalize them, put an excess profits tax on them. And now, when the auto industry is struggling, the policy is to reward those firms, right, that are squandering our resources, taking big losses. So we've got a policy put in place. Now the gas prices are down, and so President Obama's backed off on his excess profits tax for the oil industry. But nevertheless, it was part of his campaign. We've announced a policy where if firms are successful and productive and making profits, we're going to penalize them. And if firms are unsuccessful and losing money, we're going to subsidize them and support them. Right? We're doing that with the auto industry, of course, all the financial institutions, all those bailouts. This is a policy that's going to be exceedingly hard to reverse because the economy will recover. Firms are going to start to make profits again, but we've set the precedent for subsidizing failing firms, and at least announced the policy of penalizing successful firms. I just recently reread Atlas Shrugged. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. And it doesn't, it's a 50-year-old book, but you read through it and it's like you're reading current events. It's a little bit eerie. So, you look at what's happened over the last year, and it's just mind-boggling and breathtaking when you look at these policies, the Federal Reserve policy, TARP, the bailouts, the stimulus package. You put this all together, and these programs have the potential to fundamentally undermine the market system, the capitalist system that we know now. They have the potential to be as substantial a change in our economic system as the New Deal. That's the change part. I hope that's not true. And let me tell you why I'm a little bit optimistic. We hope, I would hope we can reverse these policies. We can hope there will be a backlash against this significant intervention. I have to say, President Obama gives a good talk, and I think it's easy to be won over by his rhetoric. I am. I watched the State of the Union address, I'm skeptical, and afterwards I'm thinking, wow, that guy is just really But reality has to set in soon, I hope. The people will see, look at what the guy is doing. Yeah, he talks a good game. Our first indication of that, I think, is going to be the midterm elections coming up a little bit less than 2 years, as I think that will be a referendum on Obama's policy. So it'll be interesting to see. The reason why I'm hopeful really doesn't have anything to do with current conditions, but more past conditions. I really don't feel good about what's going on right now with regard to federal government policy. But I've had this feeling before. Like, I'm old enough and I've been around enough. I've had this feeling before. When was the last time I had it? It was about 30 years ago. Let me go back 30 years ago, 1979. President Carter was in office. Carter had one of the things he ran on was the so-called misery index, which is the sum of inflation and unemployment. And he says, look at the misery index, how high it is under President Ford, that when you add together inflation and unemployment. When Carter was running for re-election 4 years later, the unemployment rate was higher than when he got elected, and the inflation rate was higher than when he got elected. For some reason, Reagan never mentioned the misery index in the campaign. Carter made such a big deal about it. We had periodic gas lines because we still had a legacy of Nixon's wage and price controls. The price controls were still on gasoline. We still had periodic lines at the gas pump. With a stagnating economy, we had American hostages in the American embassy in Iran, you may remember. And for those of you that do remember the 70s, you probably also remember polyester leisure suits and disco music. So the decade was just there's a lot of negative things about the 70s. And there was good reason to be pessimistic, and I didn't feel too good about things in 1979, 30 years ago. But other people didn't also, and when President Reagan was elected in 1980, do you remember when President Reagan was elected in 1980, the highest marginal income tax rate was 70%. And I keep this in mind. Sometimes people say things aren't politically feasible. Well, as an academic, I don't really need to worry about that myself anyway. But when Reagan was elected, the highest marginal income tax rate was 70%. In 1989, after Reagan had left office, the highest income taxpayers paid a marginal rate of 28%. So if you're in the highest income tax bracket, your marginal rate fell from 70% to 28%. If you'd asked me in 1980, would that be possible that we could see that kind of decline in marginal tax rates? I would have said no. Now, if you ask me if things are possible, I say, well, I'm an academic, I don't worry about that. But there's an example where something that seems like politically this just wouldn't be possible. It happened. We had a prosperous decade in the 80s. 1989, 20 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. Move up to 10 years ago, 1999. It's the end of the Clinton administration, but we had a prosperous economy. We had a federal budget surplus. So my reason for optimism really isn't anything about looking at current conditions. I wish I could point to something in current conditions and say, I hope things turn around. But rather, it's looking back 30 years ago to 1979 and what things looked like there, and there was a backlash. And the ideas of liberty came to the forefront. And I'm hopeful that will happen again. I think there's some reason for pessimism, but I'm an optimist by nature, and though I don't see what the grounds for hope is, historically I see things can change, and I'm optimistic we can turn this around. If not, I do seriously believe what we've seen happen in the last year will fundamentally change the nature of American capitalism.